October installment of the St. Joseph's Businessmen's Association's Featured Speakers Series lectures. We're streaming live from historic McCabe Theater on the campus of St. Mary's Academy and College in St. Mary's, Kansas. It is our great pleasure to be able to welcome to our meeting our guest speaker and his staff, and also those of you who are joining us through the internet. Before I introduce our featured speaker for this evening, I would like to ask our chaplain, Father John McFarland, to lead us in an opening prayer.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, St. Joseph. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen.
Thank you, Father. A couple of technical notes before we begin. It should be said that our guest speakers are just that, our guests, and so they don't necessarily condone, agree with, or hold all of the views that we hold, and vice versa, of course. So after our speakers finish this evening with his lecture, we would like to open up the floor for any questions, if he's still okay with that after his talk. As our online audience will not be able to hear otherwise, we are going to try to provide a microphone. Is that going to happen, Tim? We will provide a microphone for you to ask questions so that the online audience can actually hear the question and the response as well. So once the questions come to an end, or we need to bring the meeting to a close, I will come back to the podium and officially end the meeting. If you're viewing this lecture online, you can type in questions for the speaker in the comments box on the right of your screen in real time throughout the talk. Mr. James Vogel, sitting at the front, editor of Angelus Press, will be moderating all online questions. And now our featured speaker for this evening, Congressman Tim Huelskamp, was elected to his first term as a United States Representative in November of 2010. He represents Kansas's 1st Congressional District, the district which we are now in, that St. Mary's is located in. Congressman Huelskamp was born near and raised on a family farm in Fowler, Kansas. He is a Catholic and attended elementary and high school in Fowler, where he was also a member of St. Anthony's Parish. Following high school, Congressman Huelskamp went to seminary in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and afterwards pursued his bachelor's degree in social science education at the College of Santa Fe. After he obtained a PhD in political science with a specialization in agriculture policy at the American University in Washington, D.C., Congressman Huelskamp decided to return home to farm, ranch, and raise a family with his wife, Angela, in Fowler. The Huelskamps are the proud parents of 4 adopted children. Before coming to Congress, he was first elected to the Kansas Senate in 1996, the youngest senator elected in 20 years. Tim was reelected by his constituents 3 times by wide margins in the year 2000, 2004, and 2008. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Congressman Tim Huelskamp.
Thank you. It is a distinct pleasure to join you this evening, and thank you for being here tonight. And I was a little worried when they indicated 30 to 40 minutes of talking. I will tell you, I'd rather try to answer questions, but I would like to give you an update on a few things in Washington. But first, I don't know if you did hear the news, but another man was caught jumping the White House fence this afternoon. And they caught him and said, "No, Mr. President, you have 2 years left." Are we allowed, Fred, to have a little humor here? So, yeah. And there was a woman jumping in the other way. They said, "No, Hillary, you got to wait 2 years." But with that, we had a little of my personal background. Let me give you a little bit more of that and my background in Congress. I did serve in the state legislature for many years, have my lovely wife, Angela, and 4 adopted children, and ages 19, 17, 12, and 8, and they're quite a challenge, especially with my schedule in Congress. But let me address a few particular issues, then we'll get in a little bit more to the content of my talk. First of all, the issue of Ebola that has been on the forefront of a lot of folks' minds. Pretty clearly, there's an easy answer: stop importing Ebola and quit bringing in flights from countries that are infected, and let's have a commercial flight ban immediately, and then we'll get down to business. The second thing is a little more closely to home, and that's Fort Riley and the issue of ISIL, the Islamic State, and let's be clear here, they are not advisors. These men and women that are on the ground, 500 men and women from Fort Riley, they will be under fire. They are getting closer and closer to the front line every day. And don't let the folks in Washington fool us and think they're just advisors. They will be under fire. It's good to see they finally decided to name the operation. So that means they can actually maybe receive combat pay and medals. But I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm saying let's just be clear about what is happening with our folks at Fort Riley. I'd like to talk a little bit about the economy and a little bit what's going on there. We have Business Men's Association. I think that's an appropriate topic. Here's a number you need to think about today, and that's 22.7 million. 22.7 million. It's a number that's not changed, essentially unchanged in the last 6 years, and that's the number of Americans looking for a full-time job. 22.7 million Americans today are still looking for a full-time job in the economy, and that is very poor. If you look at the mainstream media, they'll continue to report all the unemployment rates going down. There's a reason for that, because people are quitting looking for work. And we're showing that. We're not seeing that here in Kansas. Thank you to good policies coming out of our state capital, but we're seeing across the nation. But let me talk a little bit about what I see, what I hear from Kansans about why our economy nationally is stuck in neutral or worse. And why is that? Perhaps it's the 45 million Americans today, 45 million plus that are on food stamps. About a decade ago, 13 years ago, that number was about half. Actually, less than half, 18 million about 13 years ago. Today, we're at 45 million. Perhaps the fact the economy is struck in neutral might be the fact that, as one small businessman confided to me, only 1 in 30 applicants that comes into his business actually is qualified and willing to work. 1 in 30. It's tough to find folks. Or maybe it's another applicant that's come into another businessman, said, you know what, the young lady came in, applied for the job, and then said her minimum salary requirement was $28,000 a year. Well, why was that the minimum? She said, because that's what I can make from the welfare system. And so you've got to significantly exceed 28 million. So in my mind, the American entrepreneurial spirit sees a way forward, but our government keeps throwing up roadblocks. And what we call these roadblocks, and among other things, is we call them overregulations, or as we call them here in what they call flyover country, we also call it stupidity. And so tonight I'm going to discuss a few of those things that I think are hammering and holding back particularly small businesses. But when I see what goes on in Washington, I'll say, if you're a big business, let's pick Boeing for example. In my opinion, Boeing's got all the power they need. They're able to hire the lobbyists. They're able to take care of themselves. They're able to flash a lot of campaign donations. But it's the small businesses like you have here in St. Mary's that really need an advocate. And you say, well, what's so important about small businesses? If you look at the history of economic growth in our country, it's not big businesses that drive economic growth. It is small businesses. It's small businesses that hire one person or take someone part-time to full-time. But tonight I'm going to talk about a few of the things that are dragging that down. But let me tell you what happened, though, in 2009 and 10. I am a Republican, but that was the time when you did have one party, a Democrat Party, controlling Washington. And they gave us some things we're still working through. One would be Obamacare. I'd like to talk about that tonight, affectionately called the Affordable Care Act, that's made health care very unaffordable for many, many Americans, and Kansans in particular. They also gave us Dodd-Frank, and we got some folks in this room I know that are living with the impact of Dodd-Frank, which was financial reform. The very folks who brought us, as they told us, to the brink of economic financial disaster in the financial system, turned around and passed, the very same folks passed and implemented reforms that were going to fix the problems. And that's created plenty of problems in our financial sector. And lastly, in those 2 years, they also gave us trillion-dollar deficits. trillion-dollar deficit. Does anybody in this room know how many zeros are in a trillion? Too many. All of them. 12 zeros. And looking around the room, and the wise answer came from someone that might be young enough to pay this all back. And some of the old folks in this room probably don't have to worry so much about it. And that is the part of the real moral dilemma, that we're going to spend money today, and this has been going on for years. We're going to spend money today we don't have and make our children and grandchildren pay it off. And don't be confused that somehow it's nobody's going to have to pay anything back. This last year, you paid about $250 billion in interest because of previous spending. And it didn't start in the last 6 years. Actually, the last time they had a balanced budget in Washington, or actually cut spending year to year, was when there was a Kansan in the White House. It's a long time ago. And Ike really got some heat for doing that. Because you know what he cut? He actually cut the military budget. It was pretty hard for him to do that, but we can talk about that. But let me talk a little bit about Obamacare and some of the restraints and limitations and punishments on small business. I do serve on the Small Business Committee. I do serve on the VA Committee. I'd like to talk about that a little bit later. But a number of things have come up under Obamacare that apparently they didn't know before. Because you had to pass, don't forget, you had to pass the bill to find out what was in it. And that is literally true. Not only did they not know what's in it, they also didn't know all the regulations that would come out of it. And actually, if you look in the last year, the current administration did win a victory. They passed more finalized regulations in 1 year than anybody else has in the history of this country. 26,000 pages of new regulations. And if you're a small businessman and woman trying to make a profit, putting someone there to read those regulations, to capture those and figure out how to deal with them, that doesn't make you any money. All it does is keep generally some attorneys employed, and it pulls away out of the economy. But 26,000 pages of new regulations, so it's a high, and it's one I hope we're not proud of. But if you look particularly about Obamacare, let me tell you a story of a gentleman named Mike Bergmeyer. He's in South Hutchinson. He's in a business that they export around the world, and Mike employs 47 folks today, and he testified before my Small Business Committee. Here's what Mike said, and he really shocked the folks in Washington because he said it like it was in Kansas style. He said, you know what? He said, I employ 47 people, and as long as there's Obamacare on the books, I'm never going to hire another person. Well, why? He said, no, it'll make me more money. He said, but I'm not going to go over 50 employees. I'm not even going to get close to them. We call them 49ers because under Obamacare, if you have 50 plus employees, you get hammered with a different set of regulations. So folks are staying at 49, or they're trying to cut their businesses in two, or cut them in half, or move in another part of town. Or if you're in the fast food business, this is a true story. We have a case where one fast food business, I won't say which one it was, on one side of the street, another one on the other side of the street, they trade employees during the week. So if you drive through McDonald's and you see the Hardee's guy at the window, so you forgot to change before you come across the street. So this is actually occurring because under Obamacare, it also says you have to work, if you work 30 hours, that's a full-time week. And so there's an incentive in Obamacare to say you can only work 29 hours a week. Now, if you're Walmart, they've been doing that for quite a while. But you did see Walmart, under Obamacare, just announced they're pushing all their employees onto the federal system, so somebody else can pay the bill. And that's a bad incentive. Also in Obamacare, we're still trying to figure out, we believe there's probably maybe, and I just asked my staff today, and they're not for sure. No one knows for sure. How many types, what's a small business under Obamacare? Is it the 50? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 500? You go through Obamacare, we think there's perhaps maybe half a dozen to 12 different definitions of a small business in the same bill. And so when you're on a Small Business Committee just trying to talk about small businesses, we argue about what exactly is a small business. How do you define that? But you know, in my 4 years in Congress, we voted 23 times to repeal Obamacare. The problem is, in my opinion, our leadership has never allowed us to debate, what would you replace it with? What would you replace it with? Couldn't you do a better job? What's the system? And it's really hard in politics or anywhere else to beat something with nothing. And I've signed on something called the American Healthcare Reform Act that actually would put consumers, individuals, in charge of their health care rather than big government or big insurance companies. Can we make that change? Can we make it happen? I think there's a long history of teaching in the Catholic Church that says that's very possible, very doable, and it provides the proper and right incentives. But we'll see after the election whether they will even let us vote on that. That's one of my frustrations, and that's not in my notes about far too often you have folks in Washington say, hey, we don't like what's there. We don't like what the administration's doing. We don't like this on health care. But you know what? I don't think we're going to take the time to debate an alternative. You know, we don't like the IRS, but I was in Congress for 3 years and 4 months before they ever allowed me the opportunity to debate the IRS budget. We all talked about it. We complained about it, but we wouldn't even debate that. So, but let me talk about a few other regulations, and as we move forward. One's pretty personal to me. I would have loved when I was 12-year-old to tell my dad, raised on a farm, say, hey, Dad, I can't go to work today because the Department of Labor says I'm too young to work on the farm. They wanted to make it illegal for most kids to work on most farms. And somebody 1,500 miles away, never saw a farm in her life, I'm sure she's the greatest gal ever, had no clue. But we were able to stop that regulation by threatening their budget. And that'll be a regular theme. If you really want to get the attention of folks in Washington and my teenage daughters, you need to talk about money and talk about their budget. A couple other things going on. Waters of the U.S. might have seen that. When they passed the Clean Water Act, they very specifically in 1970 says, Congress said those regulators can do a lot of things, but they can only regulate streams and rivers. Well, they now have proposed to regulate streams and rivers or any drop of water that ever once was in a stream or river, which means they've vastly expanded their authority and power and ability to come on your private property. And actually, where I come from in western Kansas, there's dry stream beds that have been dry for 20 years that will now come up on the map of EPA regulators, and folks in other agencies can come and regulate that. It is never ending. 26,000 pages of regulations that you got to dig through and try to figure out, okay, what does that mean for my business? How about the ones dealing with Endangered Species Act? Endangered Species Act has been around a long time, but the folks in the environmental movement figured out that, you know what, if we could find the right judge in the right court, we can go past all that law and all that requirement to go notify people. We'll just get a judge to settle with us. And it's a sue and settle strategy. It's been used in other industries. So I think it was about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. Can't remember the exact date. They went in and decided, you know what, you're going to have to list 200 new species as endangered or threatened. And that is just starting out where I come from. There's something called lesser prairie chicken. And there's folks that have never seen the lesser prairie chicken, really don't know a thing about it, have dictated that suddenly it's a threatened species, which means they get to come in and tell you what you want to do with your property. So if you were an oil well operator in western Kansas, they've determined that these birds don't like to get up early in the morning. It bothers them, so you can't go out and check your oil well or your natural gas well till 9 a.m. in the morning. And we're not kidding here. Now, that's just during mating season. Now, after July, when their mating season ends, you can get up early and check the wells. Actual restriction. If you want to drill a new well during that time period and you happen to be in a place where they want these birds to be, you can't drill. What we've seen the cases, businesses understand that. They say, well, we're not going to western Kansas to drill an oil well or central Kansas to drill a natural gas well. Or if you find that bat in this area, there'll be other things you cannot do. Did Congress pass a law on that? No. A judge issued a ruling, and it's still being fought in lesser prairie chicken, still in court. One other thing is coming very quickly related to that by the same agenda, in my opinion. Again, this is a threat to your private property rights, your ability to make a living, and to use what God has given you, and that's many parts of the global warming agenda. The president went to the UN, made some proposals, and folks, none of those have been approved by Congress. Actually, Congress shockingly turned all those things down in 2009 and 10, and the president's trying to come around behind Congress, outside of Congress, I would argue outside the Constitution, and impose his will. And I must admit, I'm biased. I like carbon. I'm a farmer. I like CO2. And but apparently that's a bad thing, according to this administration. But you know what? We haven't built a new coal plant in this country in a long time. Meanwhile, in China, I think they're building one every 2 weeks. I thought we had a global climate change issue. Folks, whether or not you agree with the agenda, whether or not you agree whether man is controlling it, let's be real here. China and India and Mexico have no desire to handcuff themselves to very expensive energy policies, but our administration does as well. So a couple other things to mention as well. One is Operation Choke Point. I do know we've had some local folks caught up in that, where the administration is hiding behind the issue of regulations based, and frankly, it's just ideology. This administration has some folks in the Justice Department, maybe all of them, I don't know how many, that don't like the Second Amendment. And they're going to go after ammunition manufacturers, gun manufacturers, and how they do that, they don't say you can't manufacture, they say you can't get credit to run your business. And that's called Operation Choke Point. It is an effort by the administration. They say not towards the legitimate businesses. I would argue that there's legitimate business in this community that is under attack simply because of an ideology in this administration. One other thing to mention, lastly, and this is about religious liberty, something that I hold very dear under Obamacare. Very clearly, under Obamacare, whether you like it or not, you will be forced to violate in some way, if they get their way, forced to violate your religious beliefs. You can go to California and see where that ends up today. Every institution in California, unless they're self-insured, and there's quite a few of those, are being forced to pay, as of the last 2 or 3 months ago, forced to pay directly for abortion. That's a mandate if you want to do business in California, unless you're able to be self-insured. Now, there's some restrictions on that as well. There's actually plenty of churches today in California that are being forced to pay for abortion. Now, they would tell us under Obamacare that there's no such thing. Well, I'll tell you that's a really big lie. Under Obamacare, there is funding for abortion that's into the system. Now, I am very opposed to that. I think it's a grave evil. And here we are forcing Americans who overwhelmingly reject the idea that government should be paying for abortion. The second issue is a little more in the news, and that's the issue of the HHS mandate. Health and Human Services has to do with contraceptives and abortion drugs and plenty of those. I will say the ruling had a few problems in it, definitely, but the Supreme Court did say that, at least in this case, Kathleen Sebelius just went a little too far in the mandates for telling you that you had to violate your conscience to provide contraceptives. But again, that's only if you're a nonprofit. If you're for business, and there's some businessmen in this community have told me that, well, Tim, once it's time to renew my policy, I'm going to be stuck. I'm going to be stuck. I'm going to have to choose between my business and my faith. And if you're a Hobby Lobby, in that case, a Protestant owner says, you know what, I'm going to choose my business. Choose my faith. And they did win in court. But the battles are not over. They will continue to grow and grow, because as soon as that came down, the administration came out with a new scheme, which again would ask you to sign a piece of paper that says, you know what, I don't want to be Catholic any longer. That's how I would have phrased that. And so I think that's a real, definitely a real threat in today's society. I actually had a lady named Kathy in Hutchinson. I won't say her last name because people are listening in on the internet, because she wants to open a bakery in Hutchinson, Kansas. I met her about 4 or 5 years ago, and she came up to an event the other night, and all excited. She's going to open a bakery, and I'm sure she would do a great job. Folks had heard about her opening a bakery. She already has homosexual couples coming to her and says, hey, would you do our wedding? Would you do this for us? They are there trying to trip her up. They want her to say, I will not do that because of violation of my faith, because they will take her to court. They've taken them to court in Oregon. They've done it in New Mexico. They've said, you know what, if you want to serve in the public square in New Mexico, you have to leave your faith in the church. And the rest of the 167 hours of the week, you can participate as a faithless American. In this case, a faithless citizen of the state of New Mexico. That is, ladies and gentlemen, that is a real threat. And you look back, though, if you look in the history of the country, I was giving a speech with right behind Senator Cruz. We were giving a speech with the Priest for Life, and they were challenging the HHS mandate, and we were out in front of the federal courthouse. And I reminded them of the history in this country. And in many schools, you don't learn that full history. But if you look at the first colony in this country that actually provided religious liberty was in the colony of Mary's Land. And that's where you could. But you know what happened? After, I think it was after about 20 years, there was an election. And at that time, all the Catholics got thrown out of office. And those that came in then passed a law said it was illegal for Catholics to participate in elections anymore. And so we haven't had the greatest history on this. It can go back to the time and place. But you look at the one Catholic signer of the Constitution, he understood that, and a long history with Mr. Carroll on that. But that's the history in this country, and history to recognize that we haven't always been blessed with a First Amendment that recognizes. And don't forget, the first part of the First Amendment is the freedom of religion. That's the first part, because our founders didn't just throw it in there by accident. They understood that a society that doesn't have faith and doesn't have a bearing in the divine is a government that will fail. But given these challenges, one thing that has surprised me in serving in Congress, I guess started with a town hall I did in Protection, Kansas, and I think it was like February of 2011. And in the past 3.5 years, I've conducted 255 town halls because I like to listen. My wife questions that, but I really do like to listen. And I go out and visit with constituents. But I had a town hall, and I asked the constituents in Protection, Kansas, there's about 12 there, I said, who still thinks the American dream is alive? Who thinks the American dream is still alive? And I define the American dream in the traditional sense, that the next generation would be better off financially or more secure or stronger families or morally more secure. And out of that room, only 2 or 3, including myself, says, you know what, I think the American dream is still alive. And that really did shock me. And I asked that question a lot of town halls. People are saying the same thing. They're worried about the future of the country. They're worried about the future of the businesses, worried about the future of the families. It's like, here was the place where was founded on these great issues and great understanding, life and liberty, and here they are under attack. And if you don't have the American dream, just think about the American dream. How many people, have you ever heard about and no offense to the country, have you ever heard of the German dream? You ever heard of the Mexican dream or the Albanian dream or the French dream? They don't talk about that because that's how we've been different as a nation. But let me tell you a story about a couple other gentlemen. One is here in Kansas. Maybe I said too much because I'm worried who might come after him. But he grew up in born in a refugee camp in the third world, came to this country, and with only money he had collected and came on a scholarship, went to school, eventually got a PhD, and now runs a very successful business and employs hundreds of folks. And this was about 3 months ago, and it was about 6:30 in the evening, and he got a knock on the door of his business. He was here at 6:39. All the employees, he was still working late, as most business owners do, working a little bit later than their employees in this case. He opened up the door, and there were 30 EPA agents outside the door. 30 of them. Now, they had riot gear on, but they didn't have their long rifles, just handguns. So they weren't fully armed. We presume that was in their trunk. They came in, said, "You will open up?" He said, "Well, why didn't you come during the day? I've been here all day." "Well, we want to come at night." They said, "You have 30 seconds, sir, to shut off all your video cameras. You have 30 seconds to shut them all down. If you're not, we're going to clip the cords on every one of them." And they did a search and investigation of a violation of the Clean Water Act based on a complaint from 4 years prior to that. They found nothing. They're still fighting it in the courts. And when I heard about this story, I went to the gentleman. I said, "You know what? I'd like to make a big deal about this. I want people to know of who might be coming after you. People should know that the EPA intimidates folks this way." He said, "Well, Tim, I'd love to let you make it public." He said, "But I'm afraid because they might come back. They have more attorneys than I do. They have a bigger checkbook than I do." And you think, well, here in America, that they can do that and get away with it? They can intimidate? Yes, that's happening right here in this state. Another instance, and this would be a Father Ray Leonard. And I got to know Father Ray about a year ago. He came to my office. It was last October. You might have heard remember that little shutdown in Washington? Government shutdown. Remember how that changed all your lives overnight? Everybody remember that? You couldn't do anything for a month because of the government shutdown? Yeah, I was thinking about that. But Father Leonard came to my office, and Father Ray Leonard, he served at the naval base in Georgia. He showed up. I can't remember what day the shutdown started, on like a Friday. He showed up on Sunday. He was a contract chaplain. He wanted to celebrate Mass on the base at Kings Bay Chapel. As he showed up, he saw a sign was on the front door. The chapel doors were locked, and it said, "Shut down. No Catholic service till further notice." And he goes out in the parking lot, and here are his parishioners coming in there. They want to go to Mass. They might want to go to confession. He said, "No, the government shut the door." They locked the door. They wouldn't even let him volunteer to celebrate Mass. This occurred in military chapels all across the country. where they locked the door. I had a case of another priest in Texas. They said, hey, we got a government shutdown. Bring in your BlackBerry. Bring in your phone. You can't have it anymore as long as there was a shutdown. He said, well, sir, I am counseling folks with traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. I said, too bad. As long as there's a government shutdown, you won't have access to your phone, and you're not an essential service. And so he was denied service. We're not sure what happened with all the folks he was seeing, but he was forbidden to do that. Father Ray Leonard was forbidden. An interesting thing about Father Leonard, and I like the name Father Leonard. My uncle was Father Leonard, and he was a priest till he passed away a few weeks ago at age 95. But Father Ray Leonard, he had served 10 years in China. And he told me in my office, he said, Tim, he said, I expected this in China, but I didn't expect it when I came back. And so we fought it, pushed hard, and finally when the government reopened, he was able to celebrate Mass again. But I will say, though, the way the military was structured, this was happening particularly almost exclusively to Catholics, because there was a shortage of Catholic priests in that case and Catholic chaplains, and they're mainly contract. So all the Catholic services, Masses, were canceled because of that. But also one thing to note as well from the same administration, talking about the military, is that anybody remember how the World War II, anybody here been to World War II Memorial? Yeah, and you realize it's not inside a building. It's an open memorial. It's wide open. You can walk in. You don't have to go in. The door, there's a bathroom, actually. I don't say the bathroom's about 40 yards from the front entrance. The night they shut down the government, they hired to either put somebody on overtime or they hired some special contractors to come in and erect barriers around this entire memorial. And then they said, boy, they couldn't get access because I had shut down the government. Well, there was no access needed if you hadn't have locked the doors, essentially. And they actually locked the bathroom door. That's what upset most of the veterans that I talked to coming to visit the World War II Memorial. But a few days later, we got back in there. So, but speaking of veterans, one thing I do want to note is some really bad stories there. I do serve on the VA committee, and I proudly do that. I've had 8 uncles, including my uncle Father Leonard, who served in the armed forces. But in my 3.5 years, I heard complaint after complaint, bad story after bad story, and let me give you a couple of those to think about. How stupid could you be, and how insensitive could you be? There's a 94-year-old veteran named Ron Supas, lived in Scott City, Kansas, and 94 years old. And I got a call, I can't remember, sometime in the spring from his daughter. He says, my father Ron would like to get his VA prescription updated. They're requiring him to come in for an annual physical. The problem with my father Ron is he can't get out of his nursing home bed. He's physically incapable. And they wanted him to get out of the bed in Scott City and drive to Wichita, maybe about 300 miles, drive to Wichita, maybe 250 miles, to see the physician for an update. Well, they complained a little bit, said, okay, we'll let you drive to Hayes. It's only 100 miles. It still would have taken an ambulance ride. So I made a call and talked to the guy in charge there, and in a couple hours he said, well, that's pretty stupid, and he fixed it. But the point is, you shouldn't have to call your congressman to take care of that. And actually, I told him there's 2 other veterans in the same situation, in the same nursing home, with 3 doctors in Scott City. They would more than happy to come over and look after the veterans. And so another thing about the VA, you might have seen that I had a number of complaints, and that went on, a number of whistleblowers as well. But I did have a complaint about Wichita, so one day I finally had enough that there was a secret waiting list in Wichita where they were telling Congress that, hey, we've been taking care of all the veterans. Then we hear that, well, maybe they aren't telling us the truth. So I drove down there. I don't know how it happened that the door, actually I do know, somebody was there bringing out a patient and putting in the ambulance. When that door was open, I was able to come back in through the emergency room area and marched up to, I got to the director's office, who was on vacation, by the way, and visited with the assistant, says, hey, what are you going to do about this? And he probably would have done nothing, or she would have done nothing, except there was a television camera crew that was following me. I mean, that's how you hold folks accountable. And at the end of the day, we made some changes. But I will say, well, and we did pass, I think, some real reforms that actually provide choice and accountability for the VA. But Why does it have to take that? Why did it have to take 20 veterans? By the way, the odds of reform at the VA, this should give you hope. The odds of reform working at the VA are 320,000 to 1. 320,001, that's the odds. Well, how do you beat those odds? You beat the one. Because there's a doctor by the name of Dr. Mitchell who served in Phoenix, and she kind of broke this scandal loose. She's going to lose her job. She's been punished. She's been intimidated. They've gone after her, both directly and indirectly. They tried to get her fired and all kinds of stuff, but she had the bravery and the courage to stand up and say, hey, you're all failing. And she's not the only whistleblower. But it was one gal, and say 320,000, that's how many folks work at the VA today. And so based on what Dr. Mitchell said, and other whistleblowers across the country came forward, contacted my office and others, we finally got some changes through on the VA. And that's at least a sign some good things can happen. But how in the heck does it take such a disaster we saw? It's big government, big regulations pushing back. And I want to thank all the businessmen and women in this room, because we're pushing back. In Washington, D.C., they're pushing back against you, making it very difficult. And I'm not amazed at how much good things are happening in Washington. What I'm amazed at is the economy still continues to move despite the difficulties I see coming out, just trying to hamstring both our small businesses and families all across this country. So what does this all mean? In one sense, one could argue, and rightly so, that King George has been replaced by King Barry. Now, people don't like me to say that. My wife probably doesn't like me to say that. I've said that a few times, but it really is. There is an incredible amount of power. And you say, well, you know what? Yeah, that's happened before, under King George. But here's the difference. Here's really the difference is the tremendous technology, the tremendous power that folks in Washington or in government have. They can listen in on any of your phone calls. They know who you're emailing. They know what your location was yesterday if you had a cell phone. They keep tracking. They could listen in. I'm not saying they're listening to all your calls, but they are keeping data points from every time you pinged off the cell phone tower. And to that, they can detail your location. As you remember, Congress, we only found out about that because basically a whistleblower. I've been lied to again and again in committees and in confidential sessions, secret sessions. Well, no, we don't do that. Well, then we find out that they admit that, and again and again. So you think about the tremendous power they have in today's technology to control and intimidate businesses and families. It is quite frightening. And so with that, St. Joseph, pray for us, and I'm going to open it up to questions and see what thoughts you all might have.
Anybody else has a question, they can come ask the question at this mic.
Or if you don't want to go to the mic, just yell it out real loud.
No, I'll repeat the question, if it's a good one, I guess. Gosh. Yes, sir.
I guess I'll start it off. I don't know if I have a good question. I guess if I hear you repeat it, I don't really want to walk up there. But, big agriculture. I know you're a fifth-generation farmer, and I guess I'm getting new at this. We just came here, and we're little hobby farmers up there and up the road here. But big agriculture, I see a problem, and it looks like a big problem. The big problem I see is mainly with the big companies, and it seems like there's a monopoly out there. We got to use these certain seeds. By the way, it's resistant to pesticides. We can throw this Roundup on it and all that kind of stuff. It's only certain companies controlling this, and it just doesn't seem sustainable to me. Maybe I'm not seeing something, but the things I'm reading, it looks like the food we're producing is to feed the world, and it may not be necessarily the food we want to improve our health. Which, oh, by the way, I think is also tied to the reason our healthcare costs are skyrocketing. That's because mainly, I don't think the food that we're getting in the shelf today is as nutritious and as healthy as it should be, and I think it's causing a lot of health problems. Mm-hmm. I'll let you comment on that.
Yeah, I didn't see a question there, but I'll comment on that. As fifth generation farmer, a lot of the technology you mentioned we've used on our farm for a long time, but clearly in agriculture as in other industries, there's a real concentration of power and lack of access to the marketplace, and we know that occurs in a lot of industries. It occurs certainly in the technology industries as well. And you know, and we have patents been around for a long time, protected since the founding of the republic, to protect the right to innovate and invent. I will say Congress in the last couple of years, over my objections, has passed some things that would make it easier for large companies to protect their patents and take them from others. And in my opinion, it was kind of interesting where we had a group of libertarian-minded Republicans like myself matching up with some Democrats that were worried about big business. But what I see in Washington, in far too many areas where you have a coalition, for lack of a better word, of big government and big business. You know, and like I said, just on Obamacare, some very large businesses loved Obamacare. I just mentioned one that was more than happy to dump all their employees on Obamacare, and they helped pass that. And so we see that in a lot of areas, but particularly, but I will say on ag policy, for a long time we've had government control since the mid-20s of ag policy. And it's cost a lot of money. I don't think it's worked very well. And I think it has encouraged the concentration that we see here. But it is hard to break open those markets, and hard to say, hey, as a limited government, who's going to come in here? We had an antitrust act. I say there are cases where I don't think it's been used very well or used appropriately to open up those marketplaces. But it is amazing of the amount and variety of food we can produce. And I have not seen any evidence that would say, hey, it's leading to health problems and rising healthcare costs. Rising healthcare costs, there's a long part of that. I think the government's the biggest part of that. So I did vote against the Farm Bill this year for a number of reasons, because I think we're going back to policies from back when I was in high school, which I think are going in the wrong direction of more government control. At the end of the day, I think that will lead to more concentration, consolidation beyond what might be borne by the marketplace. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Huelskamp, has the BLM attempted in the state of Kansas yet to prevent cattle ranchers from grazing their cattle where there are live streams, as they have done in Texas?
That's a good question. BLM, and I am so thankful that folks that preceded me in the state legislature didn't let the federal government buy much land or have much land. We have almost the smallest percentage, I think, of any state in the nation of federally controlled land, but down southwest Kansas, you have a big grazing area. And we haven't heard anything on the streams because a note to Washington, grass doesn't grow if it doesn't rain. And so the grazing area, the biggest property, which actually has a lot of lesser prairie chickens, they haven't been able to, I am not kidding. It's about 300,000 acres, and I suggested that, hey, why don't you make that all into a lesser prairie chicken habitat only, and then the federal government employees could take care of that. They didn't like that idea, but they haven't grazed it for 3 years. But specifically, I haven't heard anything because we don't have many grazing areas, and I think they use Ogallala Aquifer to water those folks. But under the issue on the regulation of waters of the U.S., there will be some very severe restrictions on watering out of streams by our livestock, both on private, and in this case on private as well as the public land, I believe. Okay, I certainly believe that.
We have a lot of regulation that goes on that seems to defy that there is a Congress. It's either a judge, as you point out, it's an EPA, it's some regulatory body. There doesn't seem to be a lot of victories to celebrate. So how do we fight that? What is Congress, or what are the voters, what do people do to combat that?
James Madison, for those who didn't study much history, is pretty important in this country. And he said the single greatest power Congress has is the power of the purse. And if you want to get an agency in line, it's all about their money. And that's where Congress and both parties has done a horrible job of not going through the budget. And I know the Senate, I think it's been 4 years since they actually passed an appropriations bill on the floor of the House which is the way you get their attention. That's the way you can go in and say, thou shalt not fund Operation Choke Point. Thou shalt not do X, Y, Z, or shall do this, you shall not. And so the Senate hadn't passed anything, not one. 4 years without passing a single appropriations bill, other than when they bring it all out one lump sum and say, here you go, and then wonder why I say, you know what, I can't stomach $3 trillion all at once. And but the House, which is run by my party, we've only done 6 out of 12 appropriations bills, which dereliction of duty, I would argue, in the House as well. So, but the budgets we've been able to do, we passed some of the EPA stuff, we've been able to go in there and say, you can't do this, you can't do that. And we've done some of that in Lesser Prairie Chicken, the waters of the U.S. Congress also has the authority to overrule regulations. It's only happened once, I think, in the history, in between some administrations. There was a bill passed in 1996 that said Congress could override a regulation, but you have to get a majority of the House, majority of the Senate, and then the President, who approved the regulation, basically would have to sign the bill. So that's fairly unusual. There will be, if there's a Republican Senate, there'll be more efforts of that. But until Republicans are willing to do their job, I would argue right now, then we're missing a great opportunity to do our job. And one of the first amendments I proposed in the House, I think was January of 2011. We opened up the House when I came in, the biggest freshman class in decades. And we said, hey, if we're going to change some things, you got to give us a chance to have an amendment. You know, it used to be you wait 5 to 10 years before you even thought about offering something like that. So I was in there my first month. My first amendment was to cut the EPA budget by 20%. Yeah. Some people are really upset, said that's all you're cutting the EPA budget. I said, well, I'm trying to compromise here. It was interesting. The other party, almost every one of them voted no. But now we had a Republican majority, but then a third of the Republicans didn't want to cut the EPA budget either. So my amendment failed, like 240 to 210. So it failed. Not because of the party in the minority, but because Republicans like to talk in this case, but didn't want to do something. But there have been cases where we've been able to shut down excesses of the administration. But again, that's a real battle. We tried to do it a year ago on Obamacare, and that's when we had the government shutdown, where far too many Republicans were running for the hills and says, hey, you know what, we're not going to take on Obamacare. That's just too popular. Don't forget, that's right when Obamacare, when the exchanges were happening. I was in the Ways and Means Committee room. I'm not on that particular committee, but I was there. I wanted to say hi to my former governor and listen in, Kathleen Sebelius. And they brought up the website while she was sitting there, and it didn't work. It didn't work. And you think, gosh, couldn't you at least made a better argument on our side? Let's push back. But I will say on Obamacare, we got another round of premium increases, deductible increases coming. And I've heard I have more hospitals than any other district in the entire country, and they're worried. There's Medicare cuts that are going to slash and burn our rural hospitals, and that's part of Obamacare. But what they've seen is a new phenomenon, as a administrator told me up, I think it was in Marysville. He said it's a different category of folks that are insured. He said that there's some newly insured as of the spring that couldn't afford health insurance before. And so they've got health insurance. But he said, I've got a lot of folks, about the same many who are now newly uninsured, that were insured 6 months ago. He said the difference about the newly uninsured is they actually have resources that take them to collections. So we just traded one group out for others. I also started to hear, if you have a $5,000 deductible, that it might be hard to collect on that before you hit that line. So the folks that in arrears to hospital, from at least the hospitals I talked to, actually the numbers are worse than they were before Obamacare because of the high deductibles and the newly uninsured folks as well. Yes, sir.
Kind of going through the news on homosexual marriage, people seem to think, or some people seem to think it's inevitable. What's your opinion, your take on that?
Yeah. Yes, we should be restating the question, I guess, for the streaming. So the question was about what's going to happen on the issue of homosexual marriage, and I will say I put that in quotes, same-sex marriage. That's not a marriage. And no matter how you look at it, and I will say as a member of Congress, it's been pretty shocking to see what's happened to the politicians on this issue. The U.S. Supreme Court in last June of 2013 issued two decisions the same day, which violated or held as unconstitutional parts of the Defense of Marriage Act, which Bill Clinton signed into law, and Joe Biden voted for. and Barack Obama thought was a good law, supposedly, and they invalidated only part of it, and that was just over a tax issue, and they found 5 folks on the Supreme Court that kind of said, well, the federal government shouldn't define marriage, which means they can define it as anything. This is undefining marriage. And there's a real slippery slope here. We're always seeing that in the courts. So, but now here, fast forward a year and a half later, we have judges all across the country who are actually ignoring the Supreme Court, because another part of the Supreme Court ruling said the state of Kansas could continue to decide marriage was between a man and a woman. Every federal judge has come in and says, we don't care what the Supreme Court said. So one could either say the Supreme Court, the 5 folks, actually they couldn't find 5 in 2013 that would have declared that somehow in the 1800s, this is the argument, that when they amended the Constitution in the 1800s, they somehow meant that was to legalize no restrictions on marriage. I say no restrictions, because every state still has restrictions on whether you can marry your cousin, marry your sister, marry mom, dad, how many marry. There's a restriction. Every state has them. This is just the one that's coming out here. So once folks start to figure that out, I think they start questioning where we're heading here. But legally, and where the court is heading, I thought it was a horrible non-decision to let these lower judges say, hey, we're going to do whatever we want and impose our view of marriage on the entire country. And they, in effect, have invalidated the votes of 50 million Americans that had voted for traditional marriage. It's in our state constitution. There will be a hearing in Kansas, I think, the day after the election. A lot of things happen the day after election. There's a reason for that. That worries me where the court might head. But our Attorney General and the Governor are pushing back to defend our marriage amendment that I wrote and helped pass in 2005. But what we've tried to focus on is the children. And, there's decades of social science evidence, as well as the moral arguments, decades of social science evidence that children need a mom and a dad. And that should be the ideal. And what we're doing here is placing adults' desires ahead of the needs of children. And so that's part of the argument. And I would say it looks like we're going to lose a lot of ground on that. But I still remember meeting a lady about a decade ago that after the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, the very next day she showed up at an abortion clinic in Wichita. She was the only one there. And who would have thought that the Supreme Court made a radical decision, imposed it on America, and here we are 40-some years later, and America says, you know what, most Americans think that was a bad decision. Most Americans understand when life begins. Most Americans do not support the president's position on abortion, or Paul Davis's position. The question is what they want to do about it is part of that as well. But so it took a long time to start to rebuild the culture of life. But when you see this pushback on the HH mandate and all these other things, they're still trying to finish what they thought they finished on January 22nd, 1973, and they still can't get that done. Thank goodness. I will say, as a Catholic, I do have a lot of Protestants come up to me and are so thankful. Said, we want to thank the Catholics for being the only ones sitting at the tip of the spear for all these years. And it's been one way, I will say, of folks, various Christians have been able to come together on issue of life. I hope that'll be the same on marriage. But I will say it was also, I did have a colleague of mine from Virginia came up to me on the floor back in September. He was beside himself. He supported my marriage amendment. I've introduced a federal marriage amendment. And he was beside himself. He was an Episcopalian. He said, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. He said, my denomination, whatever, he said, today they decided to let practicing homosexuals be ordained. I thought to myself, well, that won't be happening in mine. But that's what I'm thinking as well. So we got a long ways to go. Got into a lot there, but this is for society and civilization. But the other side, it's about creating chaos. They want to undefined, not redefine, undefined marriage. And we have a court I think in Utah, who would have thought, has said polygamy is permissible. And those cases are coming, ladies and gentlemen. So, it's what was said about other cases along the lines. And we've seen 20 or 30 years of cases like this in the court, where we're down to 3 or 4, which shows you whoever controls the U.S. Senate next year, this will be, I hope, critical issue. Yes, sir.
What do you think the most important thing for the individual or the small business owner to do to make a positive difference in the direction of the country would be?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's a small business owner to do to make the most positive difference in the future of our country? That is a tough question. Other than giving money to my campaign? No, I'm just kidding. No. No, I'm kidding on that. So that is a tough question. I do say I'm very active as one of the leading pro-lifers in Congress of trying to force through, and we're able to do marginal pro-life bills. But I will say every young person I meet, and I spoke to a youth group on Sunday night, I said, what you do, talking to your neighbor or talking to a friend in a crisis pregnancy, you're going to do more than Washington can ever get done, because you're going to change your soul and hopefully change their life. And that's what small business you need to do. It's one soul at a time. And, we often like to think about, especially, I'm a big Rolls fan. I was actually one of the founding members of the Rolls fan club in Fowler, Kansas in 1977. I go back a ways. And we're always looking for a home run. But it's usually not that easy. And so working with your community, working with your church. But I will say, you might think that the other side doesn't feel threatened by one thing you do. Take glee in that they do. At a time, the other side wants to make certain that you have very limited freedom and ability. So every time you use that for good, to me, that's just saying, hey, we don't like what you're doing in Washington. We got the big issues for small businesses trying to survive under an HHS mandate, trying to find a policy that's probably illegal. And some of them tell me what they're trying to do to get out of this mandate, that they sacrifice their view on contraception, their view on abortion, and they can't find a plan. And a number of those folks are doing things illegally, and I say, don't tell me about it. I'm not going to turn them in. And so there's a lot of civil disobedience going on, and they keep pushing back. And it's a matter of who they're going to catch and push back. So we're pushing back on the other end. But going out when Washington says you can't create a job, I drove around St. Mary's before we came over here, and it's amazing to see what is happening here. Despite the best efforts of Washington, you do see some great things happening in this community. And but I will say personally, serving as a member of Congress, it is a real challenge because not everybody that says they're for life really wants to do much about it. Not everybody who says they're pro-marriage wants to do much about it. Not everybody who says they're for limited government. Actually, most of them really don't want to do much about it. And it's a matter of pushing back, finding and articulating those principles. And I would say, whether it's me in Congress or you in your business or in your family, it makes a difference. And that's because, as we understand that we all have unique potential. We have a unique contribution. God made us for a unique purpose. And despite what's going on in government, we've got to continue to push on that, what God calls us to do, which usually is not very easy. So actually, hopefully you'll give a better statement in the future about what that should be rather than what I said, fathers. Other items, questions? Yes, sir.
The president is very fond of using executive orders to bypass Congress. But isn't there a time limit where Congress can overrule any executive order if they have a vote?
The question was on executive orders and time limits, and actually executive orders are probably better than there's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different terms for these. I'm not an attorney, thank goodness. I'm a farmer. But I say executive orders aren't even the worst of them, because executive orders are actually printed in the Federal Register. There are other executive actions that aren't printed anywhere. And you might find them on a website, you might not. But I'll say under this president, it's not the first guy to use executive orders. Actually, as commander-in-chief, that was generally understood. Okay, the commander-in-chief has that power. That's basically the executive power, those executive orders. But the extent and the number of these has just grown exponentially in the last few years. But don't worry, it's only going to get worse, because after this election. So what can Congress do about it? We don't approve of one of them, but we can go through the budget process and say, hey, you can't do this. We stop you. We'll stop that executive order. But sometimes it's even hard to find out what they're doing. But I will say one executive order that has been an absolute disaster for the president was in June of 2012. He issued an executive order, and we knew about this. Frankly, very few people spoke up. I think Steve King, myself, and a couple others said, no, Mr. President, we don't think you have the authority to grant amnesty to folks that claim to be under 18 that are coming across the southern border. But he did issue that executive order. And what happened to the number of alleged, I say alleged because they aren't carrying birth certificates, ladies and gentlemen, when they come across the southern border. Alleged folks that are 18. What happened to the numbers? They took him at his word. So just a massive spike after that executive order. And that's still happening today. We think it's closed down. But what can Congress do about it? We passed a law through the House in July that told the president, we're taking away your executive order. And did that. But Harry Reid, he's got a big desk somewhere. He put that bill along with 500 others and said, we're not even going to vote on it. So that was our attempt to push back on the executive order dealing with amnesty for those who claim to be under 18 and under duress at our southern border. That is, I talk about a humanitarian crisis created by bad policy. That is just a shame. And it's a shame of who's benefiting from that. It would be the drug lords in Mexico, the drug cartels. I can tell you stories. I sat with Senator Cruz, who works for the Attorney General of Texas and had that background as well, just talking about those stories. So for anybody to say amnesty is just going to create this, from a humanitarian perspective, it's going to create all these glamorous things, the reality on the ground is it's destroying families. There are kids that are losing their lives. And folks are being given a false promise that you come here and everything's for free. At the end of the day, with $18 trillion, that's not going to last too much longer, in my opinion. Yes, ma'am.
Did they link that virus to the immigrants that came in across the border? And what happened to those thousands of individuals? Are we supporting them?
Of the thousands, and the question was of the folks coming across the border, we don't know the number. And I will say I'm very cautious. I'll put it that way, cautious with the information coming out of the administration. We think it was at least 70,000 folks that fit this category. Again, they allege they're under 18. Most of them probably are. But I will say what we hear from those that have been able to get close, and that's been in the state of Texas, state of Arizona, is most of them are males, 15, 16, 17, 18 on up, with a lot of them with a gang history. These are not 3-year-old girls that walked 22,000 miles from Guatemala. But there are some that were brought that way. So, but what virus did they bring? I know there's some talk of that. I just say I don't know the answer to that. These are the same folks that said it's okay to continue to let flights come in from Liberia with an active Ebola outbreak. I have a colleague of mine, Jim Bridenstine's in Oklahoma. There's a base down there. This was in August. He said, member of Congress, I'm going to go visit the base because I've heard rumors that 2,000 children are being kept there that just came across the border. They wouldn't let him in. They said, go away. They had it all boarded up. They had security. They warned him, don't go. And there was no opening for him to slip in there like I did at the Wichita VA clinic. So they refused him, said, we're not going to tell you anything. So that's one of the frustrations of the job because I should know the answer to that. And I would suggest if I don't know the answer is probably not very good on that. But the Ebola deal should give you shivers that these are the same folks that are handling 70,000 undocumented folks that could come from all kinds of medical backgrounds. I don't know the answer to that. We don't know where all these children ended up. What happened to the 2,000 that were on the base in Oklahoma? They've all been moved somewhere. But we do know that almost none of them coming back for their hearings 6 months later or 3 months later, whatever it is. Who would have thought they would never come back? Yes, sir.
I think that if the Republicans maintain the House, that John Boehner would be deputy speaker, and if so, why?
Yeah. I don't know. There is suggestions he might want to retire. His second in command lost a primary. His name was Eric Cantor, and it was beat. And then you think if you lose your election, you might finish out your term. But Mr. Cantor, and I've known Eric for my 4 years up there, we didn't agree on everything. But he announced his resignation that he resigned by September. And one of my colleagues says, well, why is he resigning early? Why didn't he finish his term? I says, well, because the sooner he resigns, then the quicker his 12 months are up and he can start lobbying. And he just took a job as a consultant to make, I think, $3 million a year. I think if John Boehner did the same thing, he'd make a lot more than $3 million a year, I guess. But there's some speculation on that he might be retiring. If he runs, there's probably, I don't know, if there'll be enough votes to make him speaker, keep him speaker. You're talking to a man who is one of 12 or 18, it was, I guess, that voted for someone else for speaker, and because I thought we need new leadership in the House. And you want to be surprised at how many folks came up to me afterwards and still say, Congressman, you were right, but I'm scared what they would do to me. So, I got kicked off 2 committees for voting the way I thought my Kansas constituents wanted me to vote. And that doesn't make, you don't get invited to the cocktail parties. Never did go anyway, I guess. But we'll see what does happen, because I think that we need strong leadership willing to actually say what we're for it, to push our conservative principles, and actually try to pass something into law. I will say, visiting with Senator Cruz, he's indicated that there's a lot of folks in the Senate that would like to let a lot of things happen in the lame duck after the election, before you might have a new Republican majority. And these are not good things. These are things like tax increases and an amnesty bill and numerous other things that they might pass after the election before coming January. And that happened in 2010 as well. It's kind of like let's rush the fort before we have reinforcements. And so a lot of that will be up in the air, and that'll be debated hotly when I return in November. The vote for Speaker, what you see publicly is not till January, but the Republicans will conference and make that decision in caucus in mid-November, maybe into December. And you have to realize on the timing on that. So Republicans and Democrats, same thing, elect their leadership shortly after the election. Once they elect their leadership, then they start doling out committee assignments, which if you get the right committee assignment, ladies and gentlemen, you get to raise a bunch more cash for your campaign. They have a listing of these committee assignments. They call them an A, B, and C committee. A, B, and C, and the one Tim Huelskamp gets on. Just kidding. And if you're on, I'll just say, this happens on both sides. If you're on an A committee, there's a list out there. You've got to raise, I think it's like $500,000 for the team if you're on an A committee, or you're not considered to be a good member. If you're on a B committee, it's 300, 200, take that pick. So this all gets tied to a lot of money, which should say there was, I think Glenn Beck had a great special. I didn't get to watch the whole thing. It was a couple weeks ago, outlining how money plays in both parties and talking about who has access. You got to have money to play the game. If you want your bill to come to the floor, and I visited with Mr. Schweitzer, who authored a book about how it's, but I'll just say, are we surprised? Are we surprised? Do you think our founders would be surprised? Think about that. Who thinks our founders would be surprised? Raise your hand if you think our founders would be surprised by this. Go ahead. Okay. All right. Well, 40%. I would say, I would say, I don't think our founders would be surprised. Because they understood, in my opinion, they understood human nature. They understood power. They understood that if you give government too much power, they're going to abuse it. Because these founders, the ones who wrote the Constitution, and they had their problems, and the Constitution had some problems, particularly with a little issue called slavery, but they also understood they didn't trust government, and so they put government in a handcuff, and they said, we're going to make it very difficult for government to do anything. And you think, okay, yeah, we know they did that. We read that, Congressman, but you know what? Think about it. These were the same gentlemen that were going to be the governors. They were the same folks that were going to be members of Congress, same folks that would be senators. And all of them probably thought they'd be president one day, especially the senators. They all think that. But they said, no, we understood power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they understood that. And so I think they understood that. The problem, that's why they had a constitution, was to limit the power of Tim Huelskamp to ruin your life. Now, I'm only one of 17,000 that's ever served in Washington, but I'm one of those guys and gals, I think our founders said, and that's where people disagree on this, but I think they understood. I think we're seeing it today, that if you let government to do anything they want to do, they will do anything they want to do. And because with the decision on Obamacare, what they essentially said, Mr. Roberts himself said it, if you call it a tax, it's constitutional. So if 218 members of the House, 51 members of the Senate, and the President say that's a tax, even though, by the way, on Obamacare, they all said it wasn't a tax. They all said it wasn't a tax. Mr. Roberts and 4 other members of the Supreme Court said the U.S. Congress and the House and Senate and the President, they can pass anything they want, and it won't be a violation, at least of that part of the Constitution, which is shocking. That's what I think, whether or not you liked Obamacare. I don't. I think it was a bad decision, bad law. It's going the wrong direction. Others think so, but I said you ought to be afraid, because as long as they call it tax, they might do something you don't like. They might mandate marriages between man and woman, say we're going to tax it, and do that through law. I mean, maybe the left wouldn't like that as well. So, well, I know we got a long ways from whether John Boehner's going to be Speaker. I think there'll be a Republican Speaker, and but not for sure who it is. But there are a lot of folks that are saying, hey, we need someone that actually follows what they claim to believe is a Republican. I often say I'm a member of the Mark Twain caucus. Anybody else in here is a cousin of Mark Twain? I mean, everybody is. I think I was actually at a family reunion where they said, we're 12 cousins of Mark Twain. So, but Mark Twain, he says, do the right thing. Do the right thing. It will gratify some folks and astonish the rest. And so I'm always trying to astonish people by doing what we said we'd do. And, people might not like it, but that's what we're trying to do. And I asked my leadership to do the same thing. I said, in 2010, you had a document that you said we were going to follow. That was the blueprint for a Republican majority in the House. Well, why didn't we do that? Why didn't we do that? Why haven't we done anything on life and marriage? Why didn't we do anything? Why didn't we cut the budget? At least we capped the spending growth, but we didn't cut it, ladies and gentlemen, contrary to all the claims. It's still bigger than it ever was. One last question. I think there's a lady in the back there, I guess. Yeah, I just made a couple comments at the beginning to say I think a commercial travel ban should be instituted immediately for Ebola-infected countries. And I guess I can't say I was shocked, but for the director to say, you know what, if the CDC director said, well, if we impacted a travel ban, then we couldn't fly there. I said, well, it's a one-way ban, sir. And most Kansans will agree. Some do not. My opponent in the election thinks it's okay to allow folks to fly from Liberia that might be infected. So that was my comment on that. I announced today I'm signing on to a bill when we return, but at the end of the day, that's the president's make that call or no call. And I think there's just no common sense in dealing with this in terms of Ebola infections and sending folks over there that I hope and pray the men and women we send over there from the military have the right protections. And I can't say the other issue was on Fort Riley, though. I voted against the arming of the moderate Muslim rebels. I think that was almost in the bill. There was an amendment that said we're going to arm the moderate Muslim rebels. I'll just say nobody in Washington thinks that's ever going to happen. It was just a fig leaf to say, hey, we got to act like we're doing something, even if we're not doing something, and we want to act like we're working with the president when I really didn't care to work with him on this. So that passed, but I was really shocked to find out 2 weeks later that the first folks they're sending in are from Fort Riley. So 500 men and women are deployed there. Some went in advance. I've heard from spouses said, hey, my husband's already over there. He's been over there for a while, and he's certainly not an advisor. He's certainly getting shot at. But I think with the president, you better decide what the national security interest is here. You got to get authorization of force from Congress. That's the responsibility of Congress to declare war. And if you think, Mr. President, that you're going to bomb people from the air is going to take care of the situation, it's not. It's not. It's not going to change much, as we found out. So apparently they're getting closer to Baghdad every day. At least that's we believe what's in the media. So what I have attempted to do, at least for the Fort Riley soldiers, is say, hey, you know what? You deserve combat medals if you're going into combat. And so we've been arguing with the administration, really, literally arguing with them that, no, they said they're not going in combat. Today, I guess yesterday, they finally named the operation. Only in Washington would that be key, is to name the operation. They've named it Operation Inherent Resolve. Once you give it a name, they didn't want to give it a name, then somehow you might suggest there's a war going on. And if you suggest there's a war going on, then you have to go to Congress, supposedly, kind of figure it out. I take very seriously, and it's pretty tough, I think, to send those guys and gals over there into combat with no clear strategy for success, no exit strategy, and but what we do think the president's strategy and a lot of the folks in Washington is not about ISIS, not about Islamic State, which, by the way, is Islamic, Mr. President. He has announced a year ago he wanted to take out Assad from Syria. That's the ultimate goal. They want regime change in Syria. If you want to take care of ISIS, one of my colleagues from California made it pretty clear. He says you send arms to the Kurds and you send arms to the Syrian government, and then you take them out. And that would take care of the Islamic State. But that is not, I don't think, the ultimate goal. My hope, policy-wise, process-wise, when we go back, the president will do the right thing and present an authorization of force as required on the Constitution to move forward. And it's very interesting because this is not a partisan issue. This is bipartisan. We have a lot of libertarian Republicans like myself and conservatives like myself as well, and quite a few Democrats very worried about what we could end up doing. Don't forget, we spent hundreds of billions of dollars to train the Iraqi army. They folded in weeks. So either we didn't train them or they really didn't fold, or we haven't figured out that since the year 650 there's been a religious war going on and we're stepping right in the middle of it. You know, if you want to understand that, you got to understand a word called caliphate. I spoke at in a Christian academy of young folks. That was their homework assignment. Maybe that's yours as well. Go read up what a caliphate is if you want to understand what's happening in Syria, Iraq, and the whole region today. And don't forget, we already have an Islamic State over there. It's called Iran. And they probably are getting very close to a nuclear weapon, which is pretty scary. Other questions, comments? I think we're about at them. They're waving at the bottom, said, no more, you've ruined everything. You were our guest, you're never coming back again. If I might close as well. So thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you for a businessmen's association trying to identify how you put together your faith with making a living. And I think the world will try to tell us they don't go together, but we understand from our history and our teachings they must go together. But I do believe the government wants to separate those. They want to tell you that 1 hour a week, depends how long Father preaches, I guess, 1 hour a week, that's where you can be faithful. The rest of the week, you're ours, the other 160. And I reject that. And I think the American people have given that choice and understanding that they'll reject it as well, saying, no, faith is too important. Our government won't survive without faith. All founders understood that as well. Many of our greatest presidents did. So with that, I request your prayers, if I might, particularly for my family. This is, it might seem fun sometimes. Most times it's pretty tough. I spend about 100 nights a year in Washington, and you might say, what the heck do you do the rest of the time? I'm at home running around Kansas, but that's a lot of nights with my kids and family. The iPhones are great inventions, but it's hard to do math homework over the iPhone. So we've been working on that. So please pray for our family. Pray for wisdom for our nation. Please pray for wisdom. And we make some jokes, talk about intentions of bureaucrats in Washington, and a lot of them are well-intentioned. So let's talk about some wisdom for them and for the president and for Congress, because I honestly believe we sit at a point in time where some of the greatest gains of freedom and liberty around the world have happened, many of those right here in this nation. And we're at a precipice, I believe, where we could lose many of those and lose them very quickly. So please pray for our nation and keep me in your prayers as well. Thank you, and God bless you for having me here.
So with that, we will bring the meeting to a close. Thank you again very much, Congressman, for coming. Please join me in Thanking the congressman once again. Thank you. So I would say to stick around and have coffee, and well, there is coffee in the back. I guess there's no coffee. Never mind. Don't stick around. No coffee. Thank you all for coming very much. Good night.